The ring hit the aisle and everyone heard it, an ugly metallic note that seemed to split the polished quiet of the chapel in two. The guests blinked. The chorus of whispers swelled like wind. Arya stood at the altar, her palms slick in her bouquet, the best of them leaning forward with pity, already clenched behind polite smiles. Mark's face was a flat, indifferent mask as he turned away. No apology, no explanation. Only a slick, practiced shrug that said he had somewhere better to be. The photographer kept shooting. Someone, Vera maybe, or one of the socialites, laughed too loudly. The world that had been orbiting around that ring and that day folded inward like paper. She ran. Outside the church, past cameras and a dozen merciless phones, past murmured theories and the rustle of silk, Arya let air pour into her lungs in big, jagged gulps. She didn't look at the stunned faces behind the stained glass. Her dress, heavy and white and suddenly obscene, dragged her like an accusation. She kept running until there was the neon stab of Noir Bar ahead, a narrow, warm mouth in the cold, late afternoon. Inside, the bar was a living photograph. Low lights, brass fixtures, the smell of citrus and sugar. People who spoke in laughs, who had no idea the scandal had just been staged a block away. He was behind the polished counter, sleeves rolled up, hands going through the motions of washing a glass. He looked like a poster torn and then casually reassembled, a face carved from magazine covers, the kind of jaw that throws shadows even in dim light. If the world had a type labeled male model, he fit it. But his threadbare apron, the quiet way he fitted into the background, and the way the bar manager nodded at him like he was family said otherwise. Arya slumped onto the nearest stool, not trying to hide the mascara tracks. She wanted to disappear into the rumpled leather. He watched her for a moment, careful, not prying. Then he dried a glass and slid it across the bar as if he'd always been waiting for a woman like her to arrive. "First drinks on the house if you like to drown out bad decisions," he said, voice dry but not unkind. She glanced up. "You don't know me." "Yeah." He kept the rim of his glass aligned just so. "That's the thing about bad nights. They don't need introductions." She laughed, a sound that cracked. "I was just married." He raised an eyebrow in a way that could have been sympathy or teasing. "And now you're shopping for better exits." They traded little barbs at first, the kind that could have been flirtation if they weren't both so raw. He called himself Lane, or maybe Ethan, or maybe he didn't offer a name. He joked about poor choices and wealth of sorrow. He had an ease that suggested he'd been seen and judged before, that public eyes did not unnerve him. When the murmurs of town gossip spilled through the door in waves, two society girls with perfect hair recounting details of the staged wedding, the man's jaw tightened in a way that suggested protection rather than curiosity. When a photographer from a gossip blog pushed his camera toward the entrance and shouted a question about the runaway bride, the man, Ethan, moved. He didn't dominate the moment with some grand speech. He simply walked to Arya's side and presented himself as an obstacle. He bought her a confusion of small mercies, a glass of water, a jacket to hide the dress, the space to breathe. He gave the photographer a look that had teeth. That was the first promise, childish and practical. He put himself between her and the world that was trying to label and shame her. She noticed the tiny details. How his watch was plain, his watch band scuffed. The careful way he avoided touching her beyond a rescue hand on the small of her back. When she asked, mildly hysterical about what to do next, he said, "We don't do nothing. We do something." It started as a bargain of convenience. The idea was almost laughable. Hire a handsome bodyguard to stand at parties, to be the glossy answer to whispers, to mend appearances. Mark had left her with a wound of embarrassment and an avalanche of obligations. The board dinner the next week, a charity gala where the company's name would be bandied about by investors like an anthem. People who called themselves friends already looked sideways. Vera had been waiting in the wings with a smile sharp enough to cut. Ethan proposed a different kind of solution. "Not a bodyguard," he said. "A partner. On call. When you need someone to stand next to you, I stand. When you need someone to tell it like it is, I tell it. Not forever, not promises, just for as long as you want the world to see someone standing with you." It was a strange sort of sponsorship, No paperwork headed his way, no deposit, only a clean, quiet offer. He would be the person who could be positioned beside her in public, who could fend off insult without becoming a new scandal. He had a flat, almost military way of setting conditions. No staged photo ops that would look calculated. No secret alliances with those who had hurt her. He would not be the headline. He would be the shadow that makes headlines less hungry. "Why?" she asked after a long silence. "Why help me?" He shrugged, which might have been the worst answer in the world, except it came with an honest look. "Pick your poison," he said. "Maybe I'm bored. Maybe I like stopping people from being cruel." She didn't expect trust in the middle of a neon-lit bar. She agreed because it felt like action, and because action is better than the passive implosion Mark had offered her at the altar. They sealed the deal with grins that didn't reach their eyes, with names that weren't always true. The bar manager, Lou, slid a little napkin toward them, a silent witness. He told them about back entrances and exits, and about a room upstairs they could use if they needed to disappear from the street. "If you want to see how one midnight meeting changes everything, stay with me." Those first nights were an odd camouflage. Ethan knew exactly how to arrange his presence, so the cameras saw him as a sympathetic silhouette, rather than an obvious hired actor. He stood in the right place during interviews. He laughed loudly at the right jokes. He listened when it would make a better picture. He never tried to write their script for her. He gently shredded the ones other people had in mind. When board members and potential investors asked the family too many questions, he would wave them off with a wry comment and a steady shoulder. It was small, pragmatic warfare, the art of reducing exposure, of retaking the narrative 2 inches at a time. Morning brought a sharper war. At home, cleaned up and stubborn in her resolve, Arya sat at the long mahogany table while Mr. Sue arranged words like tools across a clean, white set of plates. Her father's calm was an armor that had been worn thin. He had questions instead of accusations, which were more dangerous. Quentin, her cousin, a man whose pleasant face sometimes hid ambition, kept glancing at his phone as if waiting for a victory text. Conversations circled around investors, reputations, and the cold business of alliances, marriages, and assets. People spoke of Mark's history with Vera, about how socialites had a way of turning private scenes into public verdicts. Vera, on the other hand, was smiling. She appeared on camera like a sunbeam made of sharp glass, charity dinners, op-eds praising the family's decency. Underneath the poise was a plan. She had friends who did favors for favors, and a Rolodex that could arrange an inconvenient photograph at 6 in the morning, or ensure that a rumor landed like a stone. She suggested practicalities with the dangerous benevolence of wolves who think they care. "We should make this a narrative of dignity," Vera said over tea the next day, voice sugar sweet. "You don't leave this industry to gossip. You own it. Show the investors you are stable." "We don't need a fixer," Arya said sharply. "We need accountability for what happened." Vera's smile cooled. "Accountability requires 2 things, money and a good public face. Appearances matter, dear." In the legal world that morning, someone, an anonymous lawyer with a velvet tone, called to warn of a planned move to freeze company accounts pending an investigation into alleged mismanagement. The timing was surgical, as if Mark had a pundit on his payroll telling him which buttons to press. The board would be rattled. Investors would be tempted to move their funds away from a house that looked like it might fall apart. If assets were frozen, it would be a long, ruinous climb back. Family lawyers advised caution. The press circled like crows, and Arya sat in the center of a small hurricane. She called Ethan because that's what she had learned to do. He came to the house like a quiet storm, moving through corridors with the knowledge of when to be loud and when to be a whisper. He did not bring lawyers or showy declarations. He brought presence, which in a world of flapping tongues can be a kind of armor. At dinner, when a cousin raised his eyebrow at the scandal, Ethan lifted his glass and made a dry joke that had the room smiling and disarmed. It was a small victory that sounded trivial until you realized the importance of small things in a cascade of reputation. He started practicing with her then, an odd apprenticeship of bruises and breath. Boxing gloves, at first more about posture and the science of balance than about hits. He taught her how to keep her chin low, how to pivot when someone lunged emotionally at her. On hiking trails outside the city, they walked until the air was thin and the conversation less dangerous because there were only trees to witness it. He asked questions that were not about the night and not about Mark, questions that asked the shape of her beliefs and the architecture of who she wanted to be. He would stand close enough to steady and far enough to let her stand on her own. The training was a symbol too. It made her feel less like a curio and more like a participant. When someone tried to mock her, she had a steadiness that made the mockery feel small. Hints about him threaded through those weeks like thin gold thread in dark cloth. He had more than a bartender's card of acquaintances. Lou, the bar manager, deferred to him in ways Arya noticed after the first week. People who lived in the periphery offered him favors. A quiet young man with a courier's bag seemed to materialize whenever Ethan needed information, and took his leave with the kind of discipline that suggested he had been told to do something important. Ethan never spoke of money, but he never seemed anxious about it either. His clothes were simple but impeccably cut. His shoes were scuffed in places a cheap pair would not be. Once, in the middle of a storm of gossip, he took out his phone and typed a few short messages into an app Arya didn't recognize. The messages were brief and efficient. Within an hour, an apologetic editor removed a false headline. A rumor that had been given wings was grounded quietly, without fanfare. It was enough to make a woman suspicious and grateful in equal measure. She started to test him in small ways, asking him to be seen with her at particular functions, to meet certain people, to navigate the moods of her investors. He did it without pretense. If anything, he seemed to relish the purity of the task, to be simple, to be efficient, to be a barrier. The first real escalation happened at Noir after midnight, on a rain-slicked Tuesday, when a private room booking went wrong. Arya had gone alone because sometimes being alone felt less conspicuous than being co-signed by a styled man. But the private room had been rented under another name. She went in to retrieve her bag and found herself trapped by hands that were rough and impatient. It was claustrophobic in a new way. There were 3 men who smelled of smoke and money and confidence. They had the kind of practiced grin that belonged to men who believed in debts collected for smiling other men. He came in like a tide shifted by a moon. Ethan moved through the door with a calm that did not scream heroics. It was the composure of a man who had rehearsed his entry. He said the men's names without error. They flinched. He was not loud, but his voice carried. "Not tonight," he said, and his tone made the words heavy. They tried to push him back. One of them shoved. But Ethan did not flinch. He took a breath, and the rest of the room seemed to decide which side to be on. Lou, the manager, materialized like a guardian from the back, hands a little wider, eyes hard. The men murmured excuses that did not hold up like damp paper. One of them reached for his phone, a move that in another life might have won him leverage. Ethan grabbed the phone and tossed it onto the table. "You don't threaten the wrong person here," he said, "and you don't take what's not offered." The men left, their egos bruised more than their bodies. Arya's knees turned to jelly. She sat on the couch and felt the world tilt back into a semblance of order, because someone had intervened with a kind of authority that wasn't merely physical. He offered his jacket. The jacket smelled faintly of citrus and smoke and something else. An order, a structure. Afterward, as they rode the empty city streets in silence, Arya watched him in the rearview mirror. "You didn't have to do that," she said. She wanted to say thank you in a way that wasn't merely a reflex. He answered simply, "I don't like seeing people cornered." She asked him about the men, who they were, who hired them, why the bar had been booked under another name. He shook his head, saying only that some people made industries out of taking advantage. The way he turned the conversation away made her angry and grateful all at once. She wanted the truth, but she also appreciated the shield. He had a talent for being unshowy, for letting his power be invisible until it was needed. Smaller things accumulated. He could call in a favor from a cab driver who always had an empty lane. He could arrange for a photographer to be distracted while an important guest left discreetly. When rumors started to bubble again, this time a whisper that someone was planning to force an emergency board vote to install a caretaker CEO while the House was in turmoil. He was the one who found a way to keep the vote unofficial and quiet. He had a way of flipping things back to neutral and making it look like she had been clever all along. but for all his competence, there were little gestures that made Arya wonder at the truth he kept. Once, in a coffee shop, their table was full of papers, investor memos, a hastily written list of contacts she might call to shore up faith in the company. Ethan sat across from her and, on a napkin, sketched a diagram in charcoal. He used a small, precise hand to map out a route of influence, naming people who could make calls, committees that could be convened. When she pressed him for his knowledge, he smiled and said, "I know people who get paid to be useful." It was the kind of answer that did not satisfy and yet explained everything. It was the mid-afternoon phone call that shifted the temperature. A voice on the other end, smooth and professional, asked for Arya, and then, once he had her on, read a list of allegations. Mismanagement, conflicts of interest, a threatened motion to transfer shares to an external trust while legal counsel reviewed the estate. The letterhead was conventional, and the timing felt surgical. Arya's stomach went cold in the middle of the summer. Ethan sat in the doorway while she listened, his eyes unreadable. When she hung up angry and tight, he said simply, "They're trying to take the house." She laughed, hard and ugly. "How? Who?" "People who sense weakness," he said. "People who always look for the small cut that will bleed the whole carcass." She wanted to fight. Her hands shook with the urge to call every investor and shout, but he stood and went to the desk, placed a small, plain business card on top of the stack without comment. There was nothing on it but a white background, an embossed symbol she didn't recognize, and a single name, Ethan. It was the most bare card she had ever seen. "You have more than a bar?" she asked. He shrugged. "People in my life are useful. That's all I'll say." Her father arrived minutes later with the lawyer, the sort of man whose voice sounded like the inside of vault doors. He spoke of preserving assets, of a plan to request an injunction if anyone stepped before the board was convened. He spoke of timelines and lawyers, as if the world were a machine that could be tinkered with by sufficient funds and goodwill. They needed time, and the time was the scarce commodity. They needed to show strength. They found it in the small theatrics at first. Ethan, for instance, became a character the press could file a story around. He gave them a photograph of a composed woman and a man who had the nobility of someone safer than the man who had run. He stood on the balcony at the charity gala, and when a camera panned to Arya, put his arm lightly around her shoulders. Not a claim, but a counterpoint. The gossip columns called him a handsome consolation, which was almost tender. Vera called it deceitful, and she began to move. Vera's moves were surgical. She sent a picture of Arya's honeymoon registry to an anonymous blogger. She made a phone call to an old acquaintance in the bank, who whispered questions into the right ears. Her allies were people who specialized in turning reputations into dossiers, and dossiers into leverage. Her plan, coarse and frightening, was to use a combination of social humiliation and legal maneuver to make the house look like a risk to the investors who were already skittish. If she could position a caretaker CEO, she could promise steadiness and harvest both influence and profit. Mark, who had shown only contempt at the altar, was central to Vera's scheme. He had not acted alone. His exit had been prepared, with cameras and whispered lies. He had been promised favors in exchange for a little public cruelty. The discovery was a slow, growing anger in Arya. The fact that her humiliation had been orchestrated, and the knowledge that those responsible were so practiced they could do it again with better choreography. A board dinner was called under the pretext of calming nerves and discussing continuity plans. Arya, who could have sent a confidant instead, chose to stand at the center of the room, to look the investors in the eye and name what had been done. She spoke with a clarity that surprised even her, less about the wounded heart and more about the company's future, the projects that had been shelved, the plans that needed funding. Her voice carried the kind of cold flame that can either inspire faith or frighten the timid. It should have been a turning point. And for a few moments it was. Investors liked a woman who could speak. A few murmurs of respect fluttered through the crowd. But then Vera, with the practiced gentleness of a woman used to having her handkerchief of influence, planted the idea of instability. She asked the right questions that the lightest-minded investors feared. What if the scandal reopened? What if there were legal complications? Who would be accountable? It was then that two things happened at once. A late message slid across Arya's phone, a recording that was circulating, footage of her in a private room 2 nights before, moments after the bar incident, her face raw and unsteady. It had been clipped poorly, but the clip complexity suggested fees had been paid. At the same time, an email went out to certain shareholders suggesting an emergency vote to appoint a caretaker CEO to stabilize operations until circumstances had been clarified. Panic is a loud animal. It makes good people do hasty things. The room breathed a little faster. Men who had promised loyalty, untucked like shirts at a beach. She felt blood go cold and remembered, with terrible clarity, that reputations do not survive in the absence of allies. Ethan was there in the doorway, looking like the only person in a room made for theater who was uninterested in the stage. He made a quiet move then. He asked for the floor without traditional fanfare, stood, and spoke in a voice that commanded no attention but gathered it. "Listen," he said. "You want facts. Facts can be produced, but let's not be rushed into actions that can't be undone. A caretaker CEO will not magically fix things. It will make them worse if it's allowed to be used as leverage now. If there are legal matters, let's let the court handle them." It was a small, pragmatic intervention. When she stepped down from the dais later that night, people whispered not about her weakness, but about her poise. Ethan had a way of making defense look like dignity. Later in the dark, someone tried to arrange a private meeting in the back lot of an exclusive club. For Arya's safety, the message said. But it was a trap. The men who came were the same kind that had bristled against Ethan a few nights prior, young and roped into a job by the smell of easy money. Someone at the club had been paid to whisper directions, to pretend the meeting was urgent. When Arya arrived, a car braked hard. She stepped out into the rain, and 3 figures converged. It would have been different if she'd been alone, but she had learned to be less alone. Ethan stepped from the shadows before she could even formulate a plea. He did not shout. He did not brandish weapons. He looked at the men and issued a single calm demand that the men leave the woman alone. One of them, bigger, with nervous eyes, hesitated. Then a phone lit up in Ethan's hand. He said 2 words, and the man's hesitation turned to a flinch so large it was almost audible. "Lou's got your tab," Ethan told him, voice flat. The men scattered. The rain pelted them and made little, shameful slicks on their collars. Arya leaned against the car, the water running cold down the neck of her dress. For the first time since the aisle, she allowed herself to be frightened and protected at once. And she liked the latter more than she had anticipated. After they escaped, when she demanded to know who had set the trap, Ethan answered in a way that balanced explanation with restraint. "Someone with a grudge," he said. "Someone who thinks small gestures can force big moves. They get hired because there are people like Vera who can pay for both the insult and its performance." "You keep saying names," she snapped, "but you never tell me who you are." He sighed, small and weary. "You think I invented the people who help when you're bleeding? I don't get to explain everything." Those words, which should have annoyed her, settled into her like an ember. She wanted facts. She wanted the ledger that would name the names and burn their reputations. She wanted to feel the world realign under her feet. But the ledger was not yet hers. In the days that followed, the stakes tightened. Her staff found anomalies in company filings, emails that suggested that someone had been moving funds subtly, rerouting small amounts in ways that looked legal until you surveyed the pattern. An advisor discovered that a set of share certificates, previously thought to be in the family trust, had a clause that allowed for transfer under certain conditions. It was the legal equivalent of a hairline fracture. On a rain-damp afternoon, Arya found herself in a quiet room with Ethan and the family lawyer, a man who had the air of someone who knew how to wait for the explosion. Papers were set down, and the lawyer's face, normally so placid, got a little hard. "There's a shadow arrangement. Someone has arranged for third-party holdings to be able to call for a review of ownership under emergencies. That's what they want." He tapped the files. "If the shareholders panic, a vote could be called. If shares move in the right direction, control could shift before the courts can untangle the chain." She wanted to tear the building down with bare hands. Who does that benefit? He looked at Ethan, who simply shrugged. People who want power and know how to make chaos profitable. That night she sat by the window, and watched the city breathe neon. She thought of Mark's face as he walked away from the altar, devoid of remorse. She thought of Vera's fluid cruelty. She thought of the men who tried to corner her, and the unexpected hands that had come to drag her back from the precipice. Beside her, Ethan sat like an unread book. She had asked him again, sharper now, to tell her the truth. He placed his palm, briefly, on the back of her hand, an intimate, non-performative touch, and he said, "I'm not who I look like." "Then who are you?" she demanded. He closed his eyes for a breath and then opened them with a clarity that steadied her. "I'm someone who thinks you deserve better than being pawned for someone else's ambition." She could have pressed for names. She could have demanded papers and credentials. Instead, she asked the question that mattered most to her. "Will you help me win this?" He nodded. "I will help you win." They built a plan that was one part legal shoring up and one part performance management. It involved calling in favors that could be called favors and assembling evidence of the kind that made courts move. He connected her subtly to people who knew how to see the patterns in the market and how to get quiet minutes with editors. In the short term, they focused on halting the emergency vote from being called. In the long term, they needed to find the list of shadow shareholders and prove the filth of the bribery that had been paid to certain witnesses. But there were signs Ethan was playing a deeper game. After a late board meeting, after a frenetic patch of calls, Arya went back to the bar to breathe. She found Ethan talking in low tones with Lou. They shared looks that were not for her. Lou handed Ethan a small plain box with a ribbon inside, a lighter, maybe, or a cufflink. Ethan took it with a gratitude that felt private. Arya felt like an outsider in her own life as she watched the exchange. She wanted to ask, to pry, to know, yet she also understood in some hard way that part of victory here required patience. The world had a rhythm. To force the reveal might ruin the strategy. He had his reasons, and those reasons, whether noble or self-serving, would have to wait for the right time. As she left the bar that night, the city lights drew long, soft coronas on the wet pavement. She thought she saw, in the reflection of a shop window, a crest embossed faintly on the lighter's case Ethan had tucked into his pocket. It was a small heraldic design, 2 dragons or maybe birds, wings curled around an orb. She frowned at it, as if the sight of an emblem could clue her into a whole life. "You have a lot of secrets," she said, simultaneously accusing and pleading. He shrugged. "So do you." A short message buzzed across her phone then, lingering evidence of his reach rather than proof of his identity. A single photo sent from an unknown number. Ethan standing in front of an office with the words, "Shen Investments," etched discreetly behind him, the name nearly invisible in the frosted glass. It was carefully framed to give her a glance without a proof. She stared at it, the world tilting. Ethan saw the expression that unfolded across her face. He reached for her hand and squeezed once, steady, intentional, and said, "I don't tell because you don't need to be wrapped in my world, but I will be in yours." It was the kind of promise that might be comforting if you believe that secrets could be gentle and protective, rather than tools of manipulation. Arya wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe he was the sort of man whose hidden power had been deployed only for her good. Outside, a cab rolled away like a small planet. Inside, the city hummed with 1,000 more plans. She held his hand and felt the steady thrum of quiet power at her fingertips. She didn't know yet that the lighter would be traced to holdings linked to one of the most powerful families in the city. She didn't know the name etched into the lighter's hinge. She didn't know that their war would soon be not merely about reputation, but about entire ledgers of money moved in the dark. For now, the secret was a glimmer, and her life felt almost manageable. They had won small engagements, one minor victory after another, yet the opposition sharpened. Vera's smile developed a new, razor-backed edge. Mark's absence at the altar became a specter to rile the company's enemies. Small, anonymous threats arrived, letters with thin, threatening sentences that were worry as much as legal intimidation. Arya read them in a kitchen that suddenly felt too bright and too small, and realized she needed more than a handsome silhouette at her side. She needed proof. At night, alone in her room with the city lights pooling on the floor, She stared at the small card Ethan had left on the desk earlier that day. The symbol on the embossed card, two birds cradling an orb, glinted like a challenge. She thumbed the edge, thinking of the way he had protected her, of the way he had refused to unroll the whole map of his past. She thought of Mark's face at the altar. Blank, dismissive, a man who thought the world would simply forgive him. When she pressed the lighter case into the palm of her hand, feeling the cool metal, it felt less like an object and more like a question. Who was he really? And how far was he willing to go to make the world stop taking things from her? The voice of the law came at dawn in the form of a terse email, a request from a group of shareholders to call an extraordinary meeting within 48 hours. The wording was precise, but menacing. In light of recent events and for the protection of investor interests, we propose a temporary oversight. The meeting, convened by an external trustee with no familial ties, would be an open door to a hostile takeover unless Arya could find backing. She paced. She called Ethan. He answered with a single sentence. "Meet me at Noir at sunrise. Bring whatever proof you have." At sunrise, the bar smelled like lemon and coffee. The city wore a thin wash of gray. Ethan was there before her, the plain card and the short, deliberate posture. He slid a thick envelope across the counter. It contained a list of names, a ledger of calls, a series of small transactions that, if traced, were pieces of a larger machine. It was not everything, but it was something. And the something was enough. Arya looked at the paper, at the names. Investors, shell companies, whispered accounts. Her heart banged in her ribs like it would burst through. She looked up at Ethan, seeking the confirmation she needed, and found only an even, quiet gaze. "You sure?" she asked. "If this is wrong, it's honest," he said. "It's not everything, but it's enough to pause them." "That will be an eruption," she said. "Vera will come at us like a storm." He smiled without humor. "Let her. We built the umbrella." They folded the ledger into a plan. It would be a legal leak, a quiet court petition to freeze any share transfers pending a forensic audit. It would be a call to reviewers who would have to move their eyebrows and their pens. It would, in essence, force the opposition to reveal themselves if they wanted to push. The plan took shape between the coffee and the dawn. But just as a net gets taut, so does tension. Someone who wanted to keep the machine running would not simply step back because of a few papers. Vengeance rarely retreats when it meets resistance. And Arya, who had once thought her life would be defined by a ring, was discovering that life could be defined by choices, by which battles to take and which to avoid. When she walked out of Noir that morning, the sun had begun to cut into the gray, making the wet pavement sparkle like a secret. Ethan walked with her to the taxi rank, and for a moment they existed in a private orbit where the world's noise was muffled. She tempted him one last time because defense had a way of becoming dependency, and she did not want to become merely defended instead of whole. She let the question hang between them and instead said, "Help me stop them. Not for me. Do it so the company doesn't drown." He looked at her as if weighing the weather. "Then let's make them see the storm," he said. They moved through the next days like two people assembling a fragile machine. Legal filings were prepared, auditors were called, and Ethan began threading together the evidence he had been collecting in the margins of their life together. Small transfers traced through shell companies, the courier who'd shown up at Noir with a manila envelope, messages deleted and recovered, and a chain of favors that tied Vera's circle to certain board votes. What he handed over to the family lawyer that week read less like drama and more like the slow, patient work of a stonecutter, each truth chipping away at the elegant falsehoods the socialites had built. At the same time, he kept being that shadow at her shoulder in public. He stood beside her at investor meetings and let her speak. He intercepted intrusive questions and, when necessary, told quiet truths in the right ears. The company culture shifted by inches. People who might have fled started to watch the numbers rather than the gossip. The momentum of markets is stubborn. Once belief shifts, even a little, traction can rebuild. But the opposition did not fold. Vera broadened her campaign. She leaked a distorted clip of Arya leaving Noir late at night with a man, a clip designed to make their arrangement look staged and transactional. An anonymous writer published a piece suggesting Arya had used sympathy to secure investor trust. A banker received a late-night call that suggested legal jeopardy if they continued to back the Sioux interests. Ethan's answers were quiet and surgical. He called an editor he had once helped with a research lead. The editor corrected the record once the original journalist's source was traced to a shell account. He produced timestamps, receipts, the courier's name. He worked with forensic accountants to create a map that showed the transfers in bright lines. When the anonymous bank caller was traced, it was to an intermediary company that led, slowly and unforgettably, to people who had benefited from the transfers. Several entities tied to a fund that had recently received payments from accounts connected to Vera's confidants. That evidence opened doors. It gave the lawyers something real to present to a court. Probable cause that action had been taken to manipulate shareholder votes and to transfer control under false pretenses. The emergency meeting that had been poised like a blade over the family house suddenly looked like a risky move for anyone hoping to profit from panic. The extraordinary shareholders meeting was called anyway. The opposition wanted a show of force. The room was a glass box of glittering suits and neutral faces, the air tempered by coffee and self-assurance. News vans lined the curb like predators. Arya took her place at the front, her hands steady in public, her jaw set, while inside a raw coil of exhaustion tightened. She had not slept much. She had hardly eaten. The pressure of being both the weather and the shelter for her family left her thin. Ethan sat in the back, unobtrusive, as always. But there was a new line to his posture. He answered a few curt messages early in the meeting, and then handed his phone to the lawyer. The lawyer scrolled and then nodded as if seeing a map he'd been missing. When a group of influential shareholders rose to request the appointment of a caretaker CEO, the room hummed with the energy of a switch being thrown. Quentin, her cousin, watched with a man who smelled of opportunism. His expression was unreadable. Vera, framed in white like a blade, smiled as if everything were going according to a long-practiced ritual. Arya stood and spoke. Her voice did not tremble. She said what the opposition had hoped she wouldn't, that she would fight the allegations with full transparency, and that an injunction should be sought to freeze any share transfers pending a forensic audit. It was a move that changed the legal terrain. It put the issue into courts instead of boardrooms. That legal move bought time, but it didn't win the war. When Marcus Shaw, a prominent outside investor sympathetic to the caretaker idea, demanded to see the ledger that proved impropriety, the lawyer produced a dossier compiled by the firm's counsel. It was thorough, but not yet definitive. The opposition pressed for immediate votes, for optics, for a public announcement that would be picked up across the city. It was then that Ethan asked to speak. No one expected him to hold the room. He stood slowly, not theatrically, and asked for 2 minutes. The chair, who had presided over many spectacles, shrugged and gave him the floor. He walked to the front as if across a carpet of quiet. Cameras angled. The air was taut. He began without preamble. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you've been presented with reasons to be afraid. I have reasons to be honest." He then did something no one had expected. He introduced himself, Ethan Shen, by name, and he laid a set of documents on the table. Certified statements, a chain of share ownership that linked an obscure holding company to Shen Investments. He showed with legal precision transfers made into a trust and the signatures authorizing them. He produced bank confirmations. He provided a statement from a courier who had handled the envelope Lou had once handed him in the bar. Then he said what the evidence meant. Some of the transfers that had been counted as decisive were made through channels now demonstrably connected to parties who had an interest in destabilizing the Sioux house. The room went quiet enough that the microphone sounded loud. Faces expressed a range of disbelief, shock, anger, curiosity. Vera's smile thinned. Ethan continued. He explained that Shen Investments held a block of shares that, under certain conditions, could be cast to resolve a deadlock. He had not announced his stake because he did not want his family's power to be used to make Arya a pawn. He had watched the weeks unfold and decided he would act only when the facts demanded him. He said plainly, "I could have stopped this earlier, but I wanted Ms. Sioux to know she had allies who stood with her because they believed in her, not because they were ordered to." His words were precise, not theatrical. Then he did the other thing no one expected. He volunteered that he would place enough of his voting rights in escrow with a neutral trustee to ensure that any rulings pending litigation would be decided transparently. But he pledged his support for a forensic audit to unmask the bribery that had been paid to shift votes. Finally, he asked for the court injunction to be honored, and he asked the trustee to refuse any transfer that could not be immediately justified. The trustee's lawyer, present at the meeting, stood and confirmed that, should Shen Investments holdings be challenged, they would cooperate with the audit, and that any transfers found to be made under false pretenses would be subject to immediate legal reversal. The legal scaffolding that Ethan presented made the room shrink around a single fact. The opposition's leverage had just been neutralized. There were protests. Vera said the move was a stunt. Mark's camp called for an independent review. But the tenor of the meeting had shifted from a hunt to a defensive scramble. Without the ability to declare a caretaker CEO, the opposition's plan to capitalize on panic looked shallow, expensive, and legally risky. After the meeting, cameras swarmed and headlines speculated over Ethan's sudden reveal. The social feeds lit up with 1,000 versions of his motives. Some called him a savior, others asked why he had kept so much hidden. Arya felt both vindicated and wary. She had wanted proof, and he had given it. She had wanted to be less vulnerable, and in that moment she felt both safer and more exposed than before. They retreated to Noir after the storm. Lou poured 2 neat drinks without asking. The bar hummed with rumors, but inside their corner the light was low and their conversation was careful. "You could have told me sooner," Arya said. He shrugged tiredly. "And put a target on your back? Or put you in a position where people would say you only advanced because of who I was? That would have hurt you in a different way." She searched his face for signs of strategy, of calculation, of sentiment. He was not naive. He had hidden campaigns of influence and quiet allies. She thought of the lighter and the crest, and the photograph of Shen Investments he had once sent without comment. Now it made sense. He had risked himself in a way that had exposed not only his name, but part of his family's holdings. It was a quiet sacrifice. "Why help me at all?" she asked. Not for the first time. He looked at her as if answering the question would explain 100 small hesitations. "Because you were wronged," he said simply. "Because people with power should not be the ones who make pain for others. Because I wanted to see you keep what is yours." They worked through the next legal stages with a rhythm, evidence assembled, forensic accountants poring over ledgers, subpoenas served. Shen Investments' cooperation turned out to be decisive. It allowed auditors to trace payments to shell accounts and then onward to accounts controlled by a fund with ties to Vera's confidants. The court, convinced by the dossier, issued temporary injunctions and authorized the forensic audit that froze the most suspicious transfers. Meanwhile, life contained impossible personal intervals. On a quiet afternoon while reviewing documents, Arya realized she had been nauseous and late. A strip hidden in the glove compartment of her car gave a small, unmistakable confirmation. She was pregnant. The news should have felt like a bomb. Instead, it complicated everything the way sunlight complicates a portrait, revealing details that had to be reckoned with. She did not tell the press. She told Ethan. He smiled, then became serious. "When?" he asked. She told him the math, the small calendar calculations. His voice was steady when he said, "We'll be careful. We'll plan. This changes nothing about the truth." He meant that his support would not waver, that his plan to protect the company would not be deflected by new tenderness. She believed him. For a week everything shimmered with softer light. She answered interviews with a composed face and a guarded joy. Ethan was gentle in private, asking about cravings and sleeping patterns, never theatrical, always practical, like the man who had taught her to pivot away from emotional jabs now stepping in to guard something tender. Then the schemers struck again. Vera, sensing a narrative she could weaponize, planted a story hinting that Arya might use pregnancy to sway investor sympathy. A paparazzo photographed Arya entering a clinic that had nothing to do with prenatal care and spun the image into insinuation. The accusation did not have to be explicit to hurt. It worked on the human tendency to prefer simple versions of complicated lives. The pressure mounted. Arya slept less. She spoke at a board meeting with a paper shielded in her hands and felt the world narrow. Late one night, after a frenetic day of defending emails and clarifying statements, she felt the sharpness, a pain that stole the breath from her chest. It was sudden and terrible. They were at the hospital in minutes. Ethan drove like a man trying to outrun outcomes. He held her hand in the emergency room and did not let the nurses take over the space between them. She was not alone. The sterility of the room and the precise faces of doctors made intimacy feel foolish and necessary at once. The diagnosis, spoken with clinical gentleness, was miscarriage. The doctors spoke of possibilities, of causes that could not always be explained, of grief that arrived without permission. No detail of grief is pretty. They spoke of it in low tones, in the sterile geometry of a corridor. Arya's world narrowed to the loss of a life she had not yet fully pictured, and the ache of being blamed and used in public while grieving in private. The schemers, smelling vulnerability, began to circle. Anonymous messages hinted that the pregnancy had been faked. Some outlets, still fishing for a sensational line, suggested strained relations as if that made the pain less real for her. Ethan did the things that mattered. He held her, called the right people, blocked the cameras from the hospital entrance with a discreet team that Lou and a few trustworthy friends assembled. He refused to let her face the world alone as it tried to make her loss into fodder for gossip. In the shadows beyond media noise, he and Arya allowed themselves the simplest grief. Quiet, honest, human mourning. Friends, Jessica, Sophie, sent meals, notes, small books about grief, and their gestures were simple remembrances of care. The miscarriage, besides being an intimate wound, changed perceptions. It stripped the narrative of some of its manipulative sheen. People who had cared more for spectacle than truth found it harder to spin the story. Empathy, even in a cynical world, is stubborn. But the personal cost was real. Arya had to carry on with the run of hearings and meetings, while also reconciling the private bruise of loss. Ethan never let his support be theatrical. He was simply there. The opposition grew bolder in other ways. An internal leak surfaced. A forged signature on a minor transfer that, once circulated, suggested Arya had hidden financial activity during her most vulnerable hours. This was a move meant to shake investor trust. Ethan and the legal team responded with a calm counterstrike. Forensic analysts confirmed the signature had been manipulated. Metadata traced the file's origin to a workstation that belonged to an employee linked to Vera's circle. The legal team filed motions, and the man who had been paid to fake documents was named in a sealed affidavit. On the corporate front, the forensic audit continued to strip away the protection the opposition had relied on. The auditors found irregularities in a series of consultant payments, and a whistleblower, one of Vera's associates whose conscience finally outweighed her loyalty, came forward with recorded phone calls. The recording spelled out arrangements and mentioned sums moving through two shell companies that were then transferred into accounts controlled by those who had benefited from a caretaker plan. This case, banks, ledgers, conversations, was the thing courts are made for. The judge, after reviewing the probable cause and the preliminary evidence, allowed certain reversals of transfer pending full review. It wasn't a final victory. It was a hinge. It was enough to prevent an immediate corporate hemorrhage. Public sentiment began to shift again, not because the tabloids decided to be kind, but because the evidence was too methodical to be dressed as rumor. Shareholders who had been on the fence withdrew their support for the caretaker plan, quietly preferring a litigious battle to being named in a scandal. In the quiet aftermath of legal maneuvers, Arya and Ethan's relationship moved into a different shape. Less strategy now, more life. There were lunches that were not prepped with talking points, nights where they sat with no agenda in Ethan's modest apartment above Noir, and mornings where they argued about nothing serious. He taught her a chess endgame one evening, and in the next, the two laughed like people who had found a small, dangerous joy in risk. But not every wound heals smoothly. The opposition, wounded and angry, tried a final gambit. They orchestrated a public stunt at a charity event, planted questions, a sudden appearance by a man who claimed to be an investor with inside knowledge, a whispered challenge about the company's governance. Vera walked the room as if wearing armor. It was meant to be an arrow at Arya's back at the precise moment she needed the least heat. Instead, the arrow bounced. Ethan, who had learned the city's angles and its quiet muscles, had prepared witnesses who could testify to the timing and to the falsified nature of the accusations. He presented, in a public forum immediately after the stunt, a series of documented payments and speaker testimonies that showed the stunt's orchestration. The man who had posed as an investor was revealed to be in receipt of funds the day prior. His testimony unraveled. Cameras caught Vera's expression as the plan collapsed. At that point, legal authorities filed criminal complaints against intermediaries who had manufactured evidence for the opposition. The stories changed from gossip to legal matters, and the world, the same world that lives off sensationalism, began to watch the slow unspooling of a conspiracy. For Arya, the victories were practical, but bittersweet. The company began to stabilize. Key investors returned or clarified their positions. The injunctions were extended pending full adjudication. The news headlines moved from speculation about a scandal to commentary about a legal battle between powerful families. The pressure on her family eased incrementally. There remained, however, personal fissures. Mr. Sue, who had borne the weight of family reputation, sat with Arya in the garden and said plainly, "I should have known better about those who surrounded us." He was not blaming her. He was allowing himself to be vulnerable in a way that earned his daughter's respect. Quentin, who had once seemed eager to benefit from the turmoil, kept his counsel closer. There were reparations to be tended to, bridges to rebuild, and integrities to reestablish. One afternoon, while reviewing proposals for the amusement park project that had nearly become a pawn in the earlier dispute, Arya received a call from Ryan Joe, the Joe Group. He'd been a background presence through murmurings and second-hand tips. He had been watching and deciding. He offered support, a formal letter of confidence in the Sioux management and a contingent agreement to hold his shares as a vote of faith until the court resolved the matters. It was a practical, powerful endorsement. It signaled to other investors that a serious group believed the company could be trusted. The tide turned slowly from there. The forensic findings, compiled in neat, grim pages, showed a web of transactions confidently connecting Vera's inner circle to payments made for false testimony and consultancy agreements. The court, after months of review, issued rulings that reversed certain transfers and froze assets of implicated intermediaries pending criminal proceedings. Share transfers performed under suspicious directives were declared void pending final adjudication. The legal restoration was neither immediate nor complete, but it was decisive enough that the company's governance remained with the family, and with Arya at its helm. In the quiet after the legal storms, the opponent's power unraveled. Vera, confronted with the evidentiary weight and facing ignominy, retreated from the charmed circle she had once navigated with ease. Mark, whose vanity had been the initial sin, found the social favors he had been promised evaporate. He issued a pale apology that read like a legal document, and then pursued business interests elsewhere. His social capital diminished. It was not the dramatic public downfall some wanted, but it was the kind of practical defeat that leaves a person diminished in ways that cannot be easily repaired. Ethan's role in all of this had been both shield and sword. He had revealed his identity at the shareholders' meeting and explained his motives, protection rather than conquest, a desire to see justice done without turning her grief into theater. He had refused to be a headline and then stepped in when the ledger required muscle. There were moments, after a victory, in the dark of the bar, when he told her the story behind the lighter, the crest, and the photograph of Shen Investments. He spoke of obligations to family, of the insistence that power not be wasted, and of the decision to remain in the margins until a moment required him. "You didn't trust me with that," Arya said once softly. "I trusted you to be yourself," he replied. "And I didn't want you measured by what I carried. I wanted you to be measured by what you could do." It was a hard-fought honesty. She understood finally that his secrecy had been its own form of tenderness, a way of letting her claim victory not as a beneficiary of his name, but as a leader who had earned her place. With the legal battles moving toward resolution, the family turned to the work of rebuilding. Arya assumed a more visible role in the company's relaunch. She led negotiations to salvage the amusement park project, refined strategy for future ventures, and spearheaded a public campaign emphasizing corporate resilience. Her image, which once hung precariously over scandal-prone gossip columns, now became associated with pragmatic leadership. Investors, cautiously optimistic, began to attend to the bottom line rather than the tabloids. Life, though, would not let them move from victory into unalloyed happiness overnight. Grief had left a subtle shadow that lengthened in certain rooms. Arya found some mornings heavy with melancholy. Ethan learned to listen without trying to fix what could not be fixed. They built practices of patience, an unglamorous love of small acts, a cup of coffee set beside a spreadsheet, a long walk around a quiet park, an unremarked embrace in the hallway at home. And then came the moment that had seemed impossible for a time. Ethan asked for her hand, not as a rescue but as a recognition. He did it not with a public gesture, but with a quiet evening at his apartment above Noir. He cooked clumsy food, lit a single candle, and put something small and simple on the table. A ring that was not ornate so much as chosen with care, a ring with a small orb engraved with two birds, the crest she had once glimpsed on the lighter. The symbolism was not meant to command, it was meant to belong. "Arya," he said, words steady, "you rebuilt what was taken from you and more. I want to stand beside you out of choice, not convenience, if you will have me." She looked at him, the man who had given up the safety of anonymity to protect her, the man who had kept secrets in service of her dignity. And she said yes. No fanfare, no cameras, just two people making a quiet covenant in the wake of a long fracture. The wedding that followed months later was a different scene from the one that had folded around a broken ring. This time cameras were invited, but their presence felt like witnesses rather than predators. It was a small ceremony, a handful of friends and family who had been true, some who had been tested and come through on the other side. Mr. Sue stood with a face softened by what he had learned about his daughter's resilience. Quentin sent a note of goodwill. Lou served drinks at the reception, smiling in a way that said this was finally someone's good night. Vera did not attend. She watched from a distance as the story concluded in a way that denied her the victory she had hoped to claim. The court proceedings would go on. Investigations would continue. Civil remedies and criminal investigations would follow their own pace. But for the people who had been most affected, the ones who had lost nights of sleep and the ones who had given weeks of quiet toil, the wedding was a kind of punctuation. At the ceremony, Arya stood before their small crowd and spoke only briefly. She did not give a speech about vengeance. Instead, she spoke about dignity and about the ways small acts of courage add up. "There is a difference between being saved and being chosen," she said. "Today, I choose to be both saved and to choose." Ethan's vow was simple, not promises of grandeur but a pledge to honesty, to presence, to the daily work of partnership. When he spoke of protecting her, his tone was neither possessive nor paternal, it was practical. He would stand beside her, he said, because she had earned her place and because standing beside her was a privilege, not a debt. After the vows, the small congregation poured into a courtyard where lanterns glowed. Music was quiet. Conversations hummed like a world returning to its proper colors. The ring on Arya's finger was not evidence of regained status, but a symbol of agency well claimed. In the months that followed, the company continued to heal. The forensic audits concluded pieces of the puzzle. Culpable intermediaries faced legal consequences. Some reputations were damaged beyond repair and faded. Ryan Joe's support had turned into a strategic partnership that allowed the company to proceed with the amusement park project under Arya's direction. New hires brought fresh expertise. The brand they rebuilt was not the same as the one that had once been built on social polish. It was steadier, more honest, and more durable. Ethan took a visible but balanced role. He did not convert his identity into a headline. Instead, he used his resources to build stabilizing structures, a trust that secured certain shares, a community fund for employees affected by the turmoil, and quiet investments that helped shore up the company's payroll during rough months. He remained at Noir sometimes, preferring the low-light intimacy of the bar where their story had quietly begun. He treated Lou as family. Lou, who had seen many things, looked at Ethan with a kind of private pride. There were days when the memory of the altar and the ring that had floated down the aisle like a dropped coin felt close. But each such memory was tempered now by the knowledge that humiliation had not been the final measure of her life. She had turned a public wound into a strategy for justice, found allies that were real and not performative, and built a partnership that had withstood exposure and grief. At times, late at night, the couple would return to the rooftop of the building where Noir's neon flickered and look at the city. They would talk about the future, careful, candid, full of plans. There was a child's laughter in an afternoon months later, a neighbor's, and Arya and Ethan would smile with a complexity that contained both sorrow and hope. The truth about the poor man at the bar had changed everything, not because it turned him into a rescuer with a fairy tale fortune, but because it exposed the way power can be used without preening, used to restore balance rather than to control. He had remained poor in affect, humble, understated, but wealthy in means that could be wielded to protect dignity. He had kept his name until the moment it would do the most good, preferring to see her rise for the person she was rather than for the name he carried. And Arya, who had once been left at an altar with a ring that had meant little, reclaimed not only the house and the company, but also the measure of herself. The city would always carry rumors, and the press would always hunt sensation. But the ledger of her life had been rewritten by proof, by law, by patience, and by those quiet acts of courage that do not make good copy but make good people. They did not pretend every scar had vanished. Some grief lingered, and honesty demanded they allow it. But at the wedding, when Ethan slid the ring onto her finger, and when they stepped into what would be a shared life of burdens and triumphs, it was clear the arc of their story had bent toward something like justice, and, unexpectedly, toward peace. If you ever wonder how a chance meeting in a bar becomes the fulcrum of a life, look not for a sudden miracle, but for the accumulation of small, steadfast acts. A man who would stand between a woman and the world, a lawyer who dared to file, an editor who decided not to take a rumor at face value, friends who brought soup and silence when it was needed. Together, these things can build a life back from the shards. They married in late autumn when the days were softer. The photograph that appeared on the front of a business magazine the next week was not of scandal, but of two people who had been tested and chosen one another in the aftermath. The ring on her finger was different now, not because it signaled wealth, but because it sealed a mutual choosing. The poor man from the bar had been, in truth, wealthier than many had guessed, but richer, in the end, in the things that mattered most. The city would always tell half the story. They had chosen to live the full measure of theirs. If you remember only one image, remember the neon bar where she first stumbled in, and the steady hand that slid across a drink. That small, ordinary mercy was where everything changed. And when the truth finally unfurled in a courtroom and a shareholder's room, it was not only a revelation of money and name, it was the recognition that power, wielded without spectacle and in defense of dignity, can undo some of the worst things people mean for each other. If this story stayed with you, you know why one midnight meeting changed everything. And if it stirred something, hope, anger, the desire to see justice, carry it into the small things you do. The world is rebuilt, in the end, by people who choose to stand where it hurts. If you'd like more stories like this, long arcs of heartbreak and hard-won redemption, there are others waiting. Subscribe, and we'll meet again for the next one.